I've been practicing patent law for about 15 years, and I want to talk about something that sucked, to be perfectly straightforward about it. This is a problem that I had a lot earlier in my career, and I call it the RCE Merry-Go-Round. And basically, it works like this. You have a rejection, and the examiner says, oh, you've got this prior art, and, I think it's pretty good. And you say, no, there's all these problems. And the examiner says, oh, I see what you're saying. Why don't you make a change to this claim? Tweak this language here. Add a word there, something like that. And you do that, and the examiner sends you another rejection that basically says, your arguments are not persuasive, or maybe they are, but the examiner found some new prior art reference, and again, it may be relevant, maybe not. I remember thinking many times that the examiner just found some new thing like window dressing, and really the core of the rejection had not changed. But they're going to make it final, and now you have to file an RCE because you have to deal with whatever they've said. And I found this ridiculously frustrating, either getting something where they say, oh, your arguments are not persuasive, or your arguments are persuasive, but they're moot in view of new ground of rejection. That was the thing that really bugged me the most. When they were moot in view of a new ground of rejection that was really, at its core, the same thing that you'd been fighting. And so you file the RCE, and you can go and you can do the same thing over and over again. Very frustrating. And so what I want to do today is I want to share how I got off of the RCE Merry-Go-Round, and it makes my life much nicer. So there were, I'll say there are two guidelines for this, and I'm going to explain how they work, and I'm going to do it kind of working backwards. So guideline number one is include all of your, I'll say, points of novelty. I understand that's a European rather than a US thing, but all your points of novelty, include them in your claims. And you can do this structuring, right, your independent and your dependent claims. You have your broad independent claims, and then you have your dependent claims, and they're going to have little, essentially like trees, right, where you have this dependent claim, and there's maybe two innovative ways of doing whatever it is that's in that independent claim, or excuse me, dependent claim, boom. So you go down, and you basically make sure that all of the things are in there. And the second thing, second guideline, is be very concrete. Say specifically. I've heard there's a word, right? The phrase picture claim, and I've heard it often used as a pejorative, but it's nice, right? I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words, something like that. But the real concept is not so much having a lot of words, it's having words that are very concrete. And what that does is it means your claims are going to very concretely focus on something that is A, of value to your client, because you will have gotten it from them anyway, and B, it's hard to kind of just find some irrelevant prior art that covers whatever this concrete thing is. And let me tell you how this works kind of in practice. And we're going to go, and we're going to be at the point where we are deciding whether or not to file an RCE. And the goal is no RCEs, right? We don't want any RCEs. We do not want to be on the RCE merry-go-round. Okay, so we're thinking, do we need to file an RCE? We've gotten ourselves a final rejection. All right. Well, why would we file an RCE? I'm going to ignore things like if you have to file an IDS or something. So this is purely about prosecution. Why would you have to file an RCE? Well, what are your alternatives? You could abandon the case, but if you're going to abandon the case, if that's a realistic alternative, then you're not going to be on the RCE merry-go-round, right? Because you're getting off by abandoning it. Like maybe the examiner really has found killer prior art. That does happen. If the examiner's found killer prior art, then filing an RCE is not going, it's really not worth much because, the prior art is what it is. All right, so that's not happening. So that's not going to happen. We're not going to get on the RCE merry-go-round for an abandonment. All right, well, why else might we do an RCE? Well, the other alternative to an RCE is we might appeal the thing, right? And again, I'm going to ignore things like after final responses because those are again, they're similar to standard RCEs. And what happens in many cases, I wouldn't say all cases, but in many, many cases, is you send it in and the examiner says, oh, this is going to require further search and consideration, therefore I am not going to allow the case. They give you an advisory action, then you have to file your RCE. So I'm going to kind of ignore that and just say, look, we have two choices. There's RCE or appeal, because the other choice is really, it boils down to those two things, assuming you're not going to abandon the case. All right, so why would I do an RCE rather than an appeal? Well, one reason is because I can make my case stronger. In fact, that's really, in my opinion, the only reason you would do an RCE rather than an appeal. Because you can say, well, appeals are slow, true. Appeals are expensive, also true. However, think about this. If you're on the RCE Merry-Go-Round, you can go around that a lot of times. And the reason I call it a merry-go-round is it doesn't seem to ever get you anywhere. You don't really go forward. So you will eventually need a way to get off of that thing. And, you know, an appeal, I mean, now or later, or an abandonment now or later. So really, yeah, it's expensive, it's slow. But on the other hand, if the choice is between a merry-go-round and an appeal, in my opinion, it's not much of a choice at all. I would go with the appeal. All right, so we're here. But why, right? So but the issue is not so much, okay, merry-go-round or appeal, because if it's merry-go-round, go to the appeal. But what if we can still make progress? Why would we be able to make progress? We might be able to make progress because, you know, there's a distinction in these claims that we could add in that would give us a really powerful argument, you know, some new sort of novel feature that, you know, we really haven't brought to the examiner's attention. That's rule number one. Get all your points of novelty in your claims, so that when you get to the point where you might be getting on the RCE merry-go-round, you can say, do I have all my points of novelty in my claims? If the answer is yes, great. Off to the appeal, or at least that's not a reason you wouldn't do an appeal, is to add more stuff. All right. What's the second reason? Well, maybe it's the language, right? The wording. So you got all your points of novelty in there, but you think, you know, if I'd phrased this a little bit differently, maybe the examiner would change their mind. And I will tell you something. I almost always, even in my own cases, I'll look at it and say, you know, I could have phrased this differently. Even in cases I get allowed. Even in cases that I've already gone through and done this exercise. In fact, sometimes I'll look at it and say, you know, the way I had it before is better. A lot of this stuff can boil down to just your preferences, style, how you feel on that day. And the substance isn't necessarily going to change because you say at least one of or one or more of, right? These are the same thing. And in many cases, those are the kinds of things that you'll be looking at when you're saying, oh, you know, I could have phrased it differently. So I wouldn't worry about this kind of stylistic stuff. If you've got the stuff in there, great. Now the question is, do you really have it in there? Is it clear? This is where rule number 2 comes in. Be concrete. Because if you are very concrete, then okay, maybe your broad independent claim, you could phrase it differently. Maybe your, you know, dependent claims, you could phrase it differently, maybe get the examiner to change their mind. But if you have a concrete claim at the end of that sort of dependency tree, then you're not going to be in a position where, you know, there's a misinterpretation, right? The broadest reasonable interpretation rule gives examiners a huge amount of leeway, and maybe you'd like to make an amendment to eliminate an interpretation that examiner has used. However, if you've been concrete leading up to it, you will not need that amendment. You will at least have that dependent claim. And if the examiner's rejected everything, then you know what? We're not going to get anywhere because we've already got a complete concrete claim and it hasn't gotten through. So any tweaks I make up the chain are probably not going to get through either. And again, we don't even have to go on the merry-go-round. We can go right to the appeal route. So that's how I avoid being on the RCE merry-go-round. And I know it absolutely increased my quality of life as a patent attorney because I felt I felt like there must be something wrong with me. I could not seem to get something allowed. Examiners, I'd have an interview, and they'd say, oh, you get over this, oh, you get over this, but I would never seem to make any progress. I would just feel like I was going in circles. And I wasn't really doing it that much, to be honest with you, but it feels that way, right? When you get on it once, or when you have to make these little changes once, you do an RCE, they say, oh, it's a moot in view of new grounds of rejection, and you feel that it hasn't really changed anything. That's annoying. And it feels awful. Whereas when you can just say, look, I did what I can do, and there is no need to continue to futz around here. We can just appeal it. Boom, done. And honestly, so I did file appeals, right? I can't say I never file appeals. I do. But I find that I don't file as many as you'd think I would. I file fewer appeals now than I did RCEs before. And I think the reason is because I'm looking towards that time, right, where I've gotten my first office action. Okay, everybody gets rejected once. You get your rejection. I'm looking towards that, whatever the examiner is going to say afterwards. And I say, am I going to be ready for that appeal? Am I at a point where either I'm going to get an allowance, or the examiner is going to find some really killer prior art, right? They'll sort of change the real basis of it, or I'm going to be ready for an appeal. And by making sure my claims are in good shape at that point, I find that I have to do a lot fewer appeals than I did RCEs. So anyway, that is a unpleasant chapter of my past, the RCE Merry-Go-Round, and how I avoid that now in my practice. I hope you never have to deal with this, but I've talked to enough people. I think I'm not the only one who's ever fought this. And if you have, try it out, right? Concreteness, all of your points of novelty, and you know, maybe you'll be able to get off it and avoid kind of repeating that unpleasant chapter any more than is absolutely necessary. Anyway, that's it. I hope everyone has a good day, good patents, and no merry-go-rounds, and I will talk to you later.